So we're talking about the intersection of energy and technology. When I think about that, there's a lot of different angles you can approach that from, particularly as a board member. Whether energy is something that is sort of a cost that sits on your budget. We spend a lot of money on energy because we're an energy consumer. Or maybe you're with a company that is an energy producer or a utility, and you're thinking about energy from the stand of how much is the demand going to go up, and what are my costs to actually produce or deliver energy to a consumer. There's also companies that are really human capital, but they're looking at, wow, AI is transforming the way I deliver my product to my customer. What's the demand increase going to be, and what does that cost look like, and how do I think about that? So there's the use of energy, there's the production of energy, there's the increasing rise of demand for energy because of AI, and frankly, because of a lot of manufacturing that's reshoring to the US, as we've seen in a lot of different industries. So, a lot of different ways to kind of approach this. And yet, we still see the energy transition is upon us, right? It might not be talked about as much or in the same way as it was a couple of years ago, but it is happening. Renewable energy is continuing to increase. The availability of that, the affordability of that continues to come down. Um, Technology continues to develop in the areas of batteries and carbon capture. And so there's a whole different way, a number of different facets and angles you can approach this from. And so when I think about my career in energy, obviously from an energy producer standpoint, but energy producers also consume a lot of energy. So we look at that also in terms of what are our efficiency opportunities and what kinds of emissions reductions targets do we have, and how do we want to think through that? So I'm just going to set that up as like sort of a big, topic to kind of dive into, and maybe ask Tej you to kick it off and talk to us a little bit about how you're thinking about energy. You being someone that interfaces with lots of different types of clients and consumers and producers. What are the top of mind things that you would like to bring into the conversation that as a panel or a community of board members we might be thinking about?
Yeah, thank you, Gretchen, and thanks for having me here and for having Chris here for this discussion. So I think the main thing that I think about in this area, first off, is my remit is global. So I take care of our energy business around the world in many different operating centers, and the question that you're posing is different depending on where you are. I think about the Philippines, where we have a significant operation. The energy transition is upon the Philippines. They're trying to get off coal aggressively due to cost considerations. That's a different consideration in the Middle East, and it's a different consideration here. So it is a very, very dynamic market. I've been in this field for about 20 years, and I've never seen as much shift as there is now. I did sit at a conference a few months ago, and someone blatantly from a banking institution actually got up and said, "Listen, the energy transition is dead. AI killed it." And it was a very bold statement. And it was the first statement that was made. And I took notice right away. And I said, well, what does that mean? And, there is a pressure in the energy world right now. We need affordable, secure, resilient energy. We know that. We know energy demand is going up now at a rate that we have not seen in the past. Data centers are upon us. The hyperscalers are coming. We're still retiring coal. We've got additional manufacturing, as you mentioned, Gretchen, coming in. So demand is increasing to a level we haven't seen in a long time. How are we going to provide all that? So really, it almost feels like the attention is now on expanding our grids, not on greening the grids. My challenge to that is that we probably need to do both of those things at the same time. So this is an and situation for me. And that makes it exceptionally tricky in terms of finding the investment, understanding emerging technologies because they are coming, and making sure that we're actually producing energy that is secure and affordable. I think that becomes a really important part of it. So I'm really high on emerging technologies, and we can talk a bit more about them later. We're seeing a lot of shifts, a lot of investment going into some of these emerging technologies, and I think that will provide a sustainable flow path into the future that also provides the affordability that we badly need.
That's great, Tej, and you've introduced quite a number of things we can circle back to the global aspect of energy and technology, how it differs around the globe. Good to come back to that. But also, you've introduced that classic trilemma of affordability, sustainability, availability, or reliability. And I'm sure that will be a repeated theme, this morning as we continue this discussion. So thank you for that intro. We'll come back to a few of those things. Chris, I want to toss the mic open to you and get a view from your perch where you've looked at this again from even different aspects than Tej and I.
Yeah, it's been Gretchen, thanks a lot, and Tej, great comments there. It's been fascinating. If I think back over my last three roles, and they've been global in nature as well. So if we go back pre-COVID, I was running our strategy and planning organization for upstream, and we had a very bullish view. Oil and gas was going to continue to grow. Then COVID happens. We see all sort of projections that are coinciding with the increase excitement about the energy transition. Chevron at that time stood up Chevron New Energies. I was asked to move over and lead our carbon capture, geothermal, and lithium business at that point. And there was all the excitement in the world about, hey, we're going to now pivot to these new forms of clean energy. Several of our competitor companies did that as well. Gretchen, Shell leaned in, BP leaned in very, very heavily, as you all know. And we made a lot of good progress over the last several years. And then I think, Tej, you hit on it. Then AI, then maybe a change in administrations happened. Different countries are working to assert their role in the energy landscape. And now we've pivoted again. And then so I moved just 3 months ago back into the very front end of our traditional hydrocarbon business, running our global exploration business. And I think the comments around global perspective and thinking about how every country, every stakeholder views things differently. And we need to think about, the word I used is energy expansion. I started talking about this just a couple years into my new energies job, realizing that we can't be having a conversation about we're going to stop oil and gas, we're going to only do wind and solar, we're going to only do carbon capture, we're not going to do traditional fuels, to meet the world's growing appetite for energy. And now with AI and the demand for data centers just exacerbating that, we need to take a Big Ten approach and look at bringing in all forms of energy, but then also decarbonization and lowering the environmental impact of the energy we produce is a very real thing. So how do we mesh that together to come up with solutions the world needs? And I think that's a challenge that every board should be thinking about, whether, Gretchen, to your point, you're a producer of energy, you're a big consumer of energy, you're maybe not a huge consumer, but you're maybe a market signaler. This is all very important for us to think about.
Yeah, that's great, Chris. Thank you. Maybe because you also brought up the global nature of this question around, what is the intersection of energy technology and what are the opportunities, but also the risks. Maybe we can go a little bit deeper into the global nature, and all three of us really have seen this, I think, from a real global perspective and probably in different parts of the globe. Certainly coming from my perspective, having just been the president of Shell USA, there was a vast difference and continues to be a difference between, for example, what shareholders in the US will ask when I would meet with them versus shareholders in Europe, which would be very interested in ESG targets, sustainability targets, emission reduction targets. In the US, really, even since I was in that job for 7 years, really very little interest over the last 7 years. Now, I think with the current political environment in DC, even less interest. But what I will say is that both Shell and Mosaic, where I'm a director, we've continued to stay very committed to our sustainability goals, our emissions reduction goals, and look very strategically at our energy consumption and how that is going to be impacting our environmental footprint. And so while we may not be leading with that in the same way we were, it's still very much, happening. But I think, and then before I was with Shell, I actually was the CEO of a Danish oil and gas company, Maersk Oil and Gas. And in Denmark, this was almost the leading question when I would meet with with the board, with my board then, or with investors is, what is, you're producing oil and gas in the Danish North Sea. This is terrible. And so, it really does have, I think, energy has a very different view, both by the public, but also by shareholders and key stakeholders, whether that's government or partners or communities where we live and work. So let's go a little bit deeper on the global nature of that, and maybe Chris, ask you to give some views, particularly from the perspective of you running, a big kind of new energy division in Chevron.
Yeah, it was a fascinating experience being in that role, and I joke that whenever I'm filling out a bio, where do you live? I live in Houston. I've been back in Houston now since 2020, but I really live on United Airlines planes and visiting all these different countries around the world, Gretchen. And it is really fascinating if you take a myopic or a narrow view, maybe just around the your local constituency or where you're based, you're going to miss really the big picture of how different countries, different stakeholders think about things differently. So you've got, I'll jump around and give a few different examples. You have countries that have just discovered hydrocarbons. Guyana is a good example. Suriname, they don't want to be left behind and not be able to monetize their
Sure.
resource, which many other countries have been doing in the Middle East, the U.S. for over 100 years. So that's a driver. Then you've got other countries that don't want to be on a hydrocarbon source from maybe a less than favorable actor. So that's driven a change in how they supply their energy. Then you've got others. It's interesting. Even some of the cleanest forms of energy. Let's pick nuclear is a good one to talk about. None of us are heavy in the nuclear business, but nuclear, if done well, very safe technology. But there are a couple of very serious incidents, and then people pivot away from that. But then that puts you backwards when you're thinking about being on a lower carbon source of energy. So I think you have to both keep the long view on where we need to keep the energy market moving over time, and sort of the mix of the energy, but then also accept the reality that the different stakeholders are going to have different perspectives about what to do in the here and now. Tej, maybe you can pick up on that.
Yeah, I do want to pick up on the one point you made about some of these, up and coming economies that have discovered fossil fuel reserves. We cannot go to them and tell them you can't use your resources. We cannot do that. They have a right to do the things that we've already done, and I fundamentally believe that. And I think that stems from, a little bit of, I think, a misconception around the energy transition and what it is. No one credible talking about the energy transition said it's the end of oil and gas. We know we need oil and gas. It has fueled civilization for a couple hundred years, and it's going to continue. The question is how much longer is it going to continue? I think that is a question that we don't really talk about very much. When I look at the global projections from various different sources, and we can quibble about the numbers, but they're in this sort of realm. 45 years left of natural gas at current production levels based on known reserves. Now there'll be other reserves out there as well. Okay, that's a generation away. Oil is not that much better than that. Coal is much longer than that. If those numbers are wrong, that's fine. But if they're only wrong by 20 years, we're still talking a generation or two before we have to transition the energy systems. So that is something that's going to play globally. And some countries are feeling that earlier than others. So you mentioned a couple, Chris. I think about Germany a lot. I mean, look at Germany. They turned off their nuclear plants. They were wholly reliant on Russia for natural gas, and they've got themselves into considerable trouble because of that. And they aren't blessed with an abundance of renewables. So their transition journey, their trajectory is going to be different than it is for the UK or for the US or for Canada. And I think we have to respect the fact that that journey is going to be different. I think that's okay. But it's a very, very dynamic world. I'm particularly concerned in how we in North America, and I'll say North America because I'm Canadian, right? So we're very close with you guys in the US, and hopefully we always will be. I think we need to be at the cusp in North America in developing these new technologies that are going to take over and really prompt energy in the future. We should be gaining that expertise, developing that technology, and exporting that expertise and that technology to the rest of the world as it goes through its transition journey. That's what I would really like to see. And that's also not what I'm seeing at the moment. which somewhat disappoints me. So I think we need to double down on that. We have lots of talent, lots of expertise. How do we actually utilize that to develop these technologies going forward? And there's many.
Yeah. No, thanks, Tej and Chris. And I think, just to pull out a few themes from what you just said, I think, first of all, we haven't used the word geopolitics yet, but geopolitics has such a huge role to play, and it's very unpredictable. It's very difficult to predict, what's going to happen if Russia turns off the taps or invades somewhere else, or, something happens in the Middle East that we're not expecting. And so, the geopolitical risk is certainly something that I think in boardrooms, no matter what industry you're in, energy and technology for that matter, geopolitics will impact that. The other thing that Tej, I'll link to your sort of platform there you were standing on about technology and the role North America should play in technology advancement and acceleration. Our regulatory environment can really hinder that, or really support that and really, allow acceleration. And so I think we've seen a little bit of both, frankly, just over the last 5 years. And so also another key risk at a boardroom that would be good to be, a talking point, because you don't control the regulatory environment. Oftentimes it's unpredictable, but there are different ways as a company to impact that and influence that, whether that's through trade associations or direct lobbying, or the like. So I think I like the sort of different things we've pulled out there. I think we're giving some ideas to folks that might sit on boards, no matter what industry you're in, some interesting questions to ask there. So I might shift a little bit. We can maybe come back to some of this in a moment, but let's talk a little bit about the role of AI and data centers. We've definitely touched on it. I would say from the perspective of my recent employer Shell, we were just watching so closely how these new value chains are being developed. And again, I would say, depending on what kind of board you're on or what industry you're focusing on, it is completely unclear at this point how those value chains are going to be developing. There are producers of energy, there are consumers of energy, but there's infrastructure challenges in between those two. And you are seeing now non-traditional companies like the Metas and the Googles and the Amazons of the world suddenly putting, which have been really human capital companies, suddenly putting billions of dollars of steel in the ground, building data centers and owning assets. And so when you think about where along that value chain are the profits going to be made, where are the profits going to be lost, what are the opportunities in terms of how those value chains are forming? And we talked a little bit about small modular reactors. Lots of companies looking at ways of generating their own power behind the meter. What's that going to look like going forward? What are the opportunities and risks? How should a board be thinking about that? So I'm going to throw that wide open, Tej, and maybe start with you on the role of AI and data centers.
Sure. So, I mean, stepping aside from the potential value of AI and helping us in the transition and modernizing grids and making grids and energy demand more efficient,
Yeah.
the other side of it, the one that we're living with right now, is the increased energy demand from the data centers, and it's profound. I don't fully believe all of it is real. I don't think it will be, but even if half of it is real in terms of the projected megawatts that are required, it's very, very significant. So what does that do to the supply chain to power these things? Because they are very energy intensive. If I went to the market right now and tried to order gas turbines to process natural gas to feed a data center behind the meter, good luck. I'm 5 years out before I'm going to get them, unless I can put in a very big purchase order for a very large number of turbines and I can jump myself up in the queue. So very difficult to do, even though natural gas is a great answer. It's easy, it's deployable, it's permittable, it fits within regulatory standards, and we've got the natural gas here. Can we do it? Well, I think it's quite difficult. It is putting demand on the small modular reactors of the world, but I hope it accelerates the development of SMRs, as we call them. I mean, these are prepackaged nukes in a box that are prefabbed in a shop, taken apart and brought to site, reassembled, and you've got your 300 to 500 megawatts just sitting there, and it's reliable. And it's got very good uptime. And a lot of these big data centers require extremely high levels of uptime, 99.5, 99.99, whatever it happens to be. Can we use this pressure to develop more of those quickly? I hope so. There are 4 small modular reactors being built in Ontario, not far from where I sit right now. That's going to total out to 1,200 megawatts. We're waiting to see how they will perform. There is still some technology risk. There is some performance risk in that frame. And the timeline to permit technologies like this, going back to your earlier comments, Gretchen, they're not inconsiderable. I don't think this promised 7-year timeline from start of a project to permitting and completion of a small modular reactor is actually correct. I just don't think it can be done quite that quickly. I wish it could, but I don't think so. The UK is going down this route as well. And then you have the renewables side. Supply chain for renewables is pretty accessible right now, actually. If you wanted utility scale solar, if you wanted big utility scale wind, you can probably access that equipment, and you can probably access some of the energy storage mechanisms out there, such as big batteries. And we are seeing a lot of big battery work in North America as well, but especially internationally. Football fields full of shipping containers that contain lithium-ion batteries. That's what we're talking about. They're pretty significant pieces of infrastructure, but they firm the grid and they firm the intermittency problem that is associated with the renewables. It might be only 3-4 hours, maybe 8 hours at most, but that technology does exist, and the supply chain is relatively easier there as well. So all these things I think have to develop at the same time to address this new demand. Where I sit in Ontario, we are projected to increase electricity demand by 70% by 2050 after having flatlined for the last 2 decades, which is, pretty unprecedented.
Yeah. No, that's great, Tej. Thank you. And I think there's lots of predictions out there about energy consumption increase. I did a little looking myself, and the thing that's really interesting that I think sometimes the 70% type numbers don't take into account is that over the last 2 decades, where we flatlined, we actually have increased the amount of energy we would consume if we hadn't implemented a whole lot of efficiency technologies along the way. So I have the optimistic view that we won't see the 70%, but we'll see something less, and that, to the point you made, and we can come back to that, the role of AI in terms of technology acceleration, I think, is going to help us there. But maybe I'll hit the ball over the net to you, Chris, and have you respond to some of that and some of what Tej just put out there.
Yeah, I love this whole topic, and we could spend another 2 hours on it. So timing is great. And I told Gretchen ahead of time, we had our Capital Markets Day yesterday, so I can talk about some stuff we've said publicly, not only from my perspective, but from Chevron's perspective. Look, one where I'll start with is, a lot of folks think of, Gretchen, your former employer, Chevron, as energy producers, but to your point at the beginning of the conversation, we're big energy producers and consumers as well, right? So Chevron produces about 5 gigawatts of what you would term behind the meter power for our own use to power our upstream operations, our refineries, our chemical facilities around the world. And what's consistent with that and data centers, it's the need, Tej, to your point, to have, 5 nines reliability or something in that neighborhood, because you can't have your power supply go down, versus a lot of the grid now is, of course, intermittent, whether it's solar during the day, wind during periods of high wind, peaking plants that top out the grid. It's a different class of customers now with the data center. So to the points made earlier, you're either going to have a permanent high reliability source of power, which natural gas powered gas turbines can produce, or you have to have something like renewables coupled with storage. And again, I think it's interesting to look at how different consumers, different hyperscalers are going to play in this space. I think some, the spectrum of how clean and how soon the energy needs to be clean will vary. And a lot of this will go into your views on the true demand predictions. Somebody put a great comment in the thread. is the demand really going to be there, or is I think the commenter was referring to quantum computing? Could that bring down some of the demand? So there's a lot of factors at play here, and I think you just need to take a thoughtful view to it. And I think that really ties us back to, you need to be placing bets in all of these areas. And again, whether you're a company like ours that's producing energy, or you're a consumer, you need to be thinking about lots of different possibilities. We're active in lithium's a great example. So lithium is going to play a role. Lithium batteries, and whether your view is it's just a natural evolution, whether it's a energy dominance perspective from what's currently going on geopolitically, we're going to need lithium. We're going to need critical mineral supply chains here in the U.S. And you know what? What's great? We have a lot of those supplies here domestically that we can produce, we can bring to market, and help fill a need. The one maybe comment I'll wrap with is the regulatory and the life cycles on these do take way longer than everybody thinks. And I think about my time in the new energies job previously, but even in our traditional hydrocarbon projects, and Gretchen, you'll know this well, from the time to discover a new oil or gas deposit to get it through, if this is one of these true major capital projects, it's 5 to 10 years. And that's for something we know how to do. And then many of these new technologies, whether it's carbon capture, that's one I can speak to most directly, just getting the regulatory regime in place to allow you to inject the CO2. What's the monitoring regime going to be? What's the, how long are you going to monitor? And it's different in every geography around the world right now. So you've got to take a long view, you got to take a broad view and a thoughtful view, and then figure out how it intersects with your particular business.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I think lots of good points there, both that you made and Tej made. I'm curious. Maybe we can go a little bit deeper into the role that AI might play in accelerating technology, recognizing that regulatory almost albatross is there. Chris, you and I were talking earlier about carbon capture, and that has for many years been sort of the big thing. Like, this is what's really going to create the energy transition, the emissions capture. And people say things like, well, it's not rocket science, like we should be able to do this no problem. And in fact, it's not rocket science, but it's really expensive. And if you don't have regulatory support from permitting to a price on carbon, or some way to kind of at least get compensated for it, there's no incentive for folks to do it. And so it gets kind of batted around as something that's really cool and interesting, but no one's ready to sign on the bottom line yet, because it's really unclear what the economic model is going to be.
Right.
So with that as a backdrop, and understanding, for example, I sit on the board of Mosaic, where we're an energy consumer, and we look at things like, well, carbon capture, is that part of our energy consumption reduction or emission reduction program? Well, it should be, but it's hard to see when it might fit into the strategic picture, knowing what we know today about carbon capture. So, and if you think about solar, wind, batteries, all of that you've talked about, what's on the kind of near-term horizon that, if I'm sitting on a board, I should be really tuning into as something that, if I hear this, man, we should be really thinking about, this is something we ought to be, that will impact us either positively or negatively, risk or opportunity. Chris, over to you on that one.
Yeah, I'll start there. And Gretchen, I'll touch on a couple of the points you made. So just to give some framing and to zoom out and give some context, and I'll start with carbon capture, because that's one that, again, it's had a lot of attention over the last 5 or so years. This is still very expensive, and this will tie to your AI comment, right? So, the storage aspect is actually relatively, now my geologist friends will get upset, but it's relatively straightforward. We can use the same types of technology, the seismic processing that we've used to identify target reservoirs. Of course, you got to drill pilot wells and understand the rock formations, but you can find locations where you can store the CO2. But that is but a small fraction of the overall cost of doing this. The capture piece is what is prohibitively expensive. So you need to be thinking about the sort of the range of types of emissions. And I'll touch on DAC here in a second and where maybe AI can help with this. So simply put, the cost of capturing CO2 is directly tied to the concentration at which it's emitted. So if you have a stream of 40% CO2 coming out of an exhaust source, it's relatively cost effective to capture. Natural gas fired turbines, though, emit CO2 at something like 4% concentration. So just by basic thermodynamics and science, it takes many more stages of equipment to capture the CO2. It's much more energy intensive and much more costly. So the cost of capture might be 70 or 80% the cost of an overall CCS project. So what we really need to do is make advancements on the capture side. And there's companies doing that in a variety of different ways. I sit on the board on Carbon Clean. Their approach, it's what we effectively call a process intensified solution, the same type of chemistry, but packaged in a more concentrated methodology, so you can lower the energy consumption, you can lower the space requirement, and deploy it in more spaces. MOFs are another technology. It's a different type of, you guys will be familiar with this, a different type of sorbent technology to capture CO2. But we're going to need, whether it's this one or this one, you're going to need to continue to make advancements. And that's where, ironically, I personally think AI is going to drive a lot of improvements. So it's not only going to be a consumer of electricity, and Tej, maybe I'll flip it to you after this. It's not only going to be a consumer of electricity, but if we harness AI correctly, it can help us deliver innovation to help us implement new solutions to bring down cost and lower consumption over time. Tej, what say you?
Yeah, that's a great segue, actually. So I go back to sort of who we are. I mean, we're a professional services firm of around 12,000 people. We don't have a significant energy signature. We don't have a significant carbon signature. It's pretty easy for us to hit our targets. If I were sort of speaking from a board perspective, if I'm a consumer of energy, I would really be taking advantage of AI to optimize energy demand. How can you use it to make your processes more efficient and lower your kilowatt hours used for your core processes? That is by far the cheapest way to address a lot of these things that are going on in the energy transition. I think there's a natural fit right there. I would love for AI to get to the point that Sam Altman often talks about of being able to invent technologies. When is AI going to help us actually create the next wave of technologies? How is it going to solve the fusion engineering problem, which is an engineering problem? It's not a physics problem. We know fusion works, but there's an engineering problem. Can AI assist us in doing that? I don't think so. Not yet. Maybe it will at some point. So we're in this sort of lag phase where AI can help us with demand and modifying and optimizing demand. It is creating additional demand on the grid. And there's a lag time to the point where it can finally help us develop the new sets of technologies that are out there. I love the reference to carbon capture, Chris. I do a lot of work in that. It's fascinating, but it's also an optimization game, because sometimes the places where you're emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere are not the same places where you have the pore space or the geology to sequester it. So then you're talking about pipeline. And you can pipe CO2. It turns into what we call a supercritical fluid. It has components of gas and liquid at the same time, but it's highly expensive. So it is definitely an option. Pulling carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere, the direct air capture, Chris, which I think you mentioned, that's an opportunity as well. But we need technological leaps in these spaces because they're pretty expensive. So affordability has to be a really, really considerable component of this. I would suggest that lowering demand is the most affordable way to deal with energy by far. And then it's into the suite of technologies that help if you're a consumer or a producer of energy.
Yeah, thanks, Tej. That's great. And thanks, Chris. And I would just maybe offer an example, when you talk about using AI to lower demand, that was happening already at Shell and before AI, it was machine learning, et cetera. So we've been using technology and really big sort of data models to predict when's the right time to be running our machines hard if power prices are lower at night, for example. It's frankly not too dissimilar from how you can optimize your own usage in your homes. You
Yeah.
have opportunities to do that. So it's the same for a business, but it's also, there's huge opportunities. We've talked about efficiency a number of times. If you are sitting on the board of a company that's a huge consumer of energy, there's plenty of opportunities to optimize, energy efficiency, whether that's the simple, getting the right lights and the right, heating and air conditioning units in and or thinking about changing out some of the old infrastructure you have in your plants if it's a plant to something new that operates at much more efficient levels. So there's huge opportunities to do that, and oftentimes not terribly expensive. It pays out fairly quickly. You get to a point where it is very expensive, so there's definitely a tipping point on those sorts of things. But that is certainly, I would say, a good set of questions to ask if you're sitting on a board. How have we been looking at using AI or technology to reduce our overall energy consumption? I'm getting a few questions in the chat that I would maybe like to kick to the panel here. There's definitely a theme here around regulatory. Someone's asking, are you seeing impacts of NIMBY? Sort of not in my backyard. What is the movement out there to reduce complexity of documentation permit reform? I think you mentioned, Chris, about permit reform or permit length of time. I think you mentioned it also, Tej. But then also kind of linked to that, how do we convince the government to support renewables at scale? So maybe talk a little bit about some of the efforts that you have either been involved with or are witnessing around permitting, NIMBY. There's also something about, are we going to see affordability for consumers challenged with the increase of yes. I sat on the executive committee of the American Petroleum Institute, which is a huge lobbying firm organization that really was out there lobbying every day and still is for permit reform. I know, Chris, your company and my company both lobby independently because, as Tej said, he said, I wish I could say 7 years we're gonna see this mass increase in the use of SMR, small modular reactors. It's not. It's the way it's working right now. It looks like it's going to take a lot longer. Anyway, open the door up to Tej. Why don't you take it from there?
Yeah, I think there's so many different elements around the regulatory process, and NIMBYism. I'll go back to that first part. So, I
Yeah.
mean, I've permitted and designed a lot of different facilities. I'm a little bit. I have a lot of experience in permitting waste energy facilities, and in
Mm.
particular, turning food waste into renewable natural gas. And no one wants those facilities in your backyard. I think it is incredibly important how we express, I'm an engineer, but how engineers express technical information to the public and to stakeholders. And we don't do that very well at all. We need to be better at storytelling very complex technologies to people who need to receive that message and to understand that there's a benefit to them. So working with stakeholder engagement people, I have stakeholder engagement people on staff that tell the story in a very different way than I would. I learn from them on a constant basis. We've got to be better about telling that story. I think we have to be incredibly better about telling this story to Indigenous peoples as well, because that has been a roadblock on large energy infrastructure in the past. How are we involving them? I like this term that I heard at a conference last week about taking Indigenous peoples from stakeholders to shareholders. How are they involving themselves in equity in these energy projects? That brings them into the projects, gives them tangible benefits. That's going to really help with the NIMBY equation of this, because quite frankly, a lot of this infrastructure is very different. It's very new and it's a little bit scary. Small modular reactors are the size of a football field, potentially. These are big. Uh, Pumped hydro energy storage systems. We work on pumped hydro energy storage. Energy storage is incredibly important but it's big infrastructure. Football fields full of batteries with thermal risks, let's call it, that we have fires of batteries every now and then. We need to do a better job explaining this to both the regulators and to the public and to politicians to make sure they understand the truth of this. And I feel like we're just not doing enough of a good job on that. Um, I think we're getting better. I honestly think we're getting better, but it is not reducing the timelines for constructing some of this infrastructure. And that is a very, very particular concern. Are the SMRs that are being built up here, I think they spent 7 years in just permitting before a shovel was put into the ground. And that's too long for prepackaged technology.
Yeah. No, thanks, Tej. And I love how you brought up storytelling.
Yes.
And I think all three of us are engineers on here, and we probably all three have gotten better at telling our stories to a variety of different audiences, and as you say, stakeholders, shareholders, real partners is what we're looking to gain. But you also, I mean, so related to that you brought up very elegantly is the community impact. And so, how many projects have we seen in our careers that have been, if not completely canceled, at least highly hindered because the community has been kind of an afterthought, hasn't been engaged fast enough or early enough or in the right way to really, become a partner or a shareholder versus just, a stakeholder that we're, a box checking type of thing. So important. And if I put myself in the shoes of a board member, that's a really great line of questioning to have on any new project is how have we addressed the community impacts? So thank you for bringing that to the table. Chris, over to you on this. I mean, you can kind of go wherever you want on that one.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna pick up. Thanks, Gretchen. I'm gonna pick up on a couple of Tej's points, and it's sort of a learning. That's what I'm gonna try to share as the theme on this one for me. So everybody knows oil and gas is easy to pick on, and there's lots of reasons that our industry has been challenged in the past. So my learning has been on working in two, and I'll give an example of two different geographies, but then two different lines of businesses, and then the similarity that's come across. So I ran our upstream operations in California, and then moved immediately to Mississippi to our largest refinery. And it was shocking. The actual, this is kind of no surprise, but the level of challenge that I found in one location and not the other in terms of the receptiveness of the I'll say the broader community, and that can mean a number of different groups. That can mean stakeholders, that can mean regulatory agencies and whatnot. But so I said, is that us? Is that the community, or is it how we've engaged? And it's a mix. So to go back to this NIMBYism thing, I really dug into this topic while I was in California, and there was a very large, I'm not going to get the correct reservoir, but the state was trying to develop a very clean new reservoir in the northern part of the state. So it would tick all the boxes of the things that you'd want, but just massive delays because the impacted community up there, of course, even though this is good for the state, people in San Francisco might like this, but the impacted folks in that region in Northern California, not a fan because they're going to lose valleys and lose things that are important to them. And then fast forward, then when I took over the new energies job, well, surely everybody's going to love this. Who's not going to love new energies? But it's the same challenge. It's if you don't communicate the story of what's the societal benefit, but then what's also the local benefit. And then I think maybe my biggest learning, and I think it's mappable to a board role when you're helping the executive team think about how to engage on any particular opportunity. Even if the concern is maybe, and this is a challenge with the three engineers, even if it's technically invalid and you go, that's silly, that's not a real issue, you can't start there. You've got to start with acknowledging the concern, acknowledging the reality, and then thinking about the way to bring folks along to address the concerns, explain it in a way that's not dismissive, that's educational and supportive, and then hopefully moving towards an alignment that the projects can move forward together. Lots of learnings there. I think we're always on a continuous journey to do that better.
Yeah, Chris, just on that, I remember my first public engagement. I was permitting and designing a composting plant And as an engineer is wont to do, I took my engineering design drawings and put them up on some easels and invited the public in and said, let's have a discussion. I have never been yelled at more thoroughly than I was in that meeting, and I deserved it. I mean, I really learned a lot, and I really love that you're talking about a learning journey because it really is. The more complex this infrastructure is that we're building, the bigger, the longer communities are actually going to live with this stuff because it's going to be around for 50 years, the more we've got to do to explain the benefits to them locally. I think that was really well put.
Yeah. No, I agree. Both of you brought up really good points there, and I would say during my time as at Shell, we commissioned a brand new polyethylene plant just outside of Pittsburgh, and that's a part of the country that used to be the steel belt and really isn't anymore. And so the on the surface, it's like, well, we built this great plant on the site of an old zinc smelter. We rehabbed the whole plant and really created a very positive environmental impact prior, and then went and built this plant. And it would be easy to say, well, we created all these jobs, and but the community hadn't had industry next door to them in over 2 generations, and so we have spent an amazing amount of time and energy. And to your point, Tej, it is not a simple like what is a polyethylene plant? Like,
Yeah.
why do I care about it? And so bringing the community in, we set up a small uh, basically little pilot plant we built really for customers to show them how we could build different or create different kinds of containers for their products. We've brought probably more of the public through there than we've brought customers because it helps explain what we're doing and why it's important and how this it can be created and turned into wrapping for food that goes into the grocery store or medical equipment. And so it is not sort of I think be happy that our jobs are there. It's a, hey, let us really help you understand what we're doing, but also let us really hear what your concerns are. Let us really listen. And so that was a really interesting journey, and I think we're still on that, in Pennsylvania, but it certainly has come along positive way over the last few years. Great. So I think I might just go to one other question that's in the chat, and then I think Jen, I'm just going to look for a nod. If then we can open it up for Q&A. Does that work? Okay, cool. So there was one other question in the chat that I wanted to just come back to, and we've touched on. Chris, you and I have been in oil and gas our careers. Tej, you've been more kind of broader energy, although I would say Chris and I are both broader energy as well now. But we're seeing, I think, maybe a little bit more of an understanding of the role oil and gas plays as we're starting to see demand for energy really increase with data centers and manufacturing, particularly if you think about reshoring manufacturing and demand in the US or North America. But we're also seeing countries set their own vision for transitioning. And so in particular, you could think of Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, where they're looking to shift their GDP away from oil and gas. Talk to me a little bit, about how that's impacting how you're thinking about the energy transition. Maybe if you think those commitments that are out there are credible, and are they going to continue to be impacting the energy system and the energy transition as we go forward? Chris, I'll kick that one to you.
Yeah, great topic there, Gretchen. It starts with, I think the intentions are always there. And I think, I think about how we set strategy, how I set strategy within my organization, how we set strategy within the company, how we set strategy at the Rice School of Engineering board where I sit. I think you always are working towards setting an ambition that you're working to achieve. And then the reality is there, as you learn more, as you It's how long do these projects take? Is there a regulatory environment that's supportive? Is there a fiscal environment that's supportive? Things can take longer than initially hoped. How I think about it is we've got to come to the table in these locales offering more than just one solution. This has to be, I think you said value chain earlier. We need to be thinking about how we meet all the needs. Okay, there may be a resource monetization at the beginning, but then how do we extend that? Because these countries will want to have downstream processing. They'll want to have some sort of finished product. So you got to think about an offering that covers additional pieces of that. How it ties to the energy expansion, energy transition. I've come to take the point of view that I believe it's, and this goes back to the beginning comments, the energy expansion, energy transition is real. And we're continually, I'm going to get my angle here wrong. I don't know if it's mirror imaged or not. We're moving up and to the right in terms of driving in that direction, but it's not a straight line. It's a sine curve, right? So there's going to be ups and downs on this journey. It's a sine curve, not a straight line or an exponential line. And I think you just have to approach it with some humility and a bit of a long view, saying, okay, we need to keep pushing this ahead. And Tej, this goes to, I think, your point about North America being the leader. Maybe you can pick up needing to be the leader, the signaler. Maybe you can pick it up from here. But there's going to be ebbs and flows. There's going to be ups and downs. And you've got to, take a long view and continue working towards that view and recognize you may have to pivot tactically over, shorter intervening periods, but keep the strategy going over the long term. Tej, you want to pick it up from there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love that you talked about the energy transition being real. It is real. It is a real thing, and it's going to continue. I was just taking a look at the spend in energy transition technology development across the world. It was higher in the first half of 2025 than it's ever been.
Yeah.
Somewhere around $400 or $500 billion globally spent, with the exception of the US, where it's dropped. So around the world, I think people are understanding that there is a finite resource sitting here. I mentioned natural gas before. The biggest reserves of natural gas in the world sit in Russia, Iran, and Qatar. That they're the ones who have the natural gas and the largest components of natural gas. Now, do we ultimately want to be making deals with them? Is that going to improve our geopolitical position and our energy security? I think perhaps not. The best example I can think of in the world for someone who kind of really gets this on a countrywide level is probably China. China is building coal plants at an alarming rate because they have access to coal. I don't know how they're putting them up so quickly, but they're also building nuclear and they're also building renewables at an incredible clip. And their entire intent, because they don't have a lot of oil and gas, is to make sure they're not subservient to other countries for their energy supply. So to me, it really does come down to energy security. And when we think about net zero goals, I mean, I understand net zero goals, but it's not just about net zero. It is, decarbonize, but we have to toss in security there and we have to toss in affordability there. As new technologies come on board and as they become more efficient, I think we'll address the affordability over time, although we're not seeing it right now. But I would make the argument that some of these low carbon technologies, like the nuclear space, do provide that energy security that we really, really badly need at a countrywide level. And that's why they're so attractive. So it's not just about net zero. Could the technologies that get us to net zero also offer that security component and that affordability component? I think yes. And I think China sees that more than anyone. So I would prefer not to cede the energy transition to China and have them develop all the technologies that we then import. I'd really not like to see that. I'm a little bit fearful that that's the way it's going, but I think there's still time to interrupt that journey because there's a lot of work that needs to still be done in technology development.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Chris and Tej, both on that one. Super. So maybe I'll just pause for a moment. I have been pulling out questions from the Q&A. So let me go to one that just came in. This is around geopolitics, and the question is around: are there non-US regions where our companies are confident or nervous about the potential for AI and cyber? There's a comment about activity in the Caribbean or Venezuela, Ecuador, Israel, natural gas resources collaboration. So you just touched on that a little bit, both of you actually. And I think, one of the things we even started off by talking about was just the role of geopolitics in energy. Frankly, the role of geopolitics in tech is equally interesting, risky, but also potentially opportunity driven. Tej has just mentioned China being potentially our biggest competitor when you look at who's developing technology faster and who's frankly setting up infrastructure faster or as fast as or definitely competing with the US and North America. But when you guys look at other areas, other countries, what kind of stands out? And maybe I would just say that I think, coming at it from a Shell perspective, clearly Europe has been much more focused on the energy transition and has aimed quite a bit more human capital and depending on how you slice it, possibly financial capital at adopting technologies faster. Maybe not at developing technologies, but adopting technologies faster. I think in some ways that puts them a little bit ahead in terms of their overall population, sort of the public's understanding and acceptance of new energy and the energy transition. But I think it has created quite a bit of risk, as Tej brought up. He said, I watched Germany, right? Germany switched off their nuclear reactors. And then, shortly after that, they're in a major, major energy crisis and frankly still are. And so, let's throw that open a little bit more around geopolitics, specific countries where you see trends moving and what maybe as a board director we would want to watch for. Tej, go ahead.
Yeah, I can take a first step. So, I mean, a couple of examples of other places to really keep an eye on. I've already mentioned China. I think about Australia. Our company is Australian owned, and they're on a very, very significant kick on putting more renewables in because they have access to it. It's abundant, lots of sun, lots of wind. They can build big batteries, and they are, and that's fine. That's what they're doing. I would really pay attention to the Middle East. I think the Middle East has a very, very interesting opportunity. We do a lot of work in the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. They are building mega projects and they are leveraging their energy resources and they're leveraging their knowledge of supply chains to get that energy out to market. So is there a possibility? I think it's coming right now of, the deserts of Qatar, massive amounts of solar that are then converted to hydrogen or ammonia, and those products being shipped through their existing supply chains and contract knowledge? I think so. I think they not only want to provide their own geopolitical security, but they want to export it to the rest of the world. We are, by the way, in the era of exportable renewables. I think of it that way. The hydrogen molecule can be created from electricity. It's expensive, but that price point is coming down as well. So, leverage security, but also do export. I think the UK is another example. The UK has 16 operational nuclear plants right now. About 10 of them are due to be decommissioned by 2030. The UK is going to go through a massive resurgence of nuclear energy. They've already appointed Rolls-Royce, the same folks who make the beautiful cars. Rolls-Royce is going to be building small modular reactors for the UK, and they'll be building additional big gigawatt scale plants as well. And that's an energy security play. And it's a very profound one, and it will change the nature of the energy spectrum in the UK. At the same time, they're pushing on bioenergy. At the same time, they're pushing on carbon capture. It's exactly what Chris said. It's not one approach that's going to get this done. They understand that this is a composition and a suite of different approaches, all with their own affordability and regulatory considerations. They all have to be evaluated and activated over time.
Great. Thanks, Tej. Really rich observations, particularly around the Middle East. Thank you. Chris.
Yeah, rather than repeat, I'll maybe touch on a couple of tangential points. I think that on the AI space, certainly what we're seeing from a customer standpoint, I think folks want the power, they want it now. That's going to drive to natural gas-fired turbines, and they want, I'm broadly speaking, and this is of course exceptions, U.S. centric right now, where you can link all those things together. So I think that's where you're going to see AI first. This other comment that was in the chat, though, on the same question is around cyber. Cyber is something, and I'm sure all the directors on the phone know this. This is something, and maybe this is a conversation that was probably started 5 years before, but this is absolutely a topic that everybody has to keep top of mind. You see the stories in the paper of companies getting getting hacked into. I think it was the Colonial Pipeline a few years ago. I've learned so much about this space just in the last maybe 5 years. I've been with the company. I've moved into more senior roles. And actually, I'm chuckling here. Our former CIO is actually on this call, and Bill deserves a lot of credit for really amping up the game on cyber preparation. Every company needs to be thinking about that, and I think the increase in AI is just going to make that even more of something we need to be mindful of.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris and Tej both. Great. So I think we're going to maybe move into a wrap up, but what I was going to ask my fellow panelists to do is maybe just spend a little bit of time just summarizing some of the key takeaways. So if we want to leave this community of 120 people with just a few things that next time they're walking into a board meeting, they might think about, particularly based on the conversation we've had today, and maybe even some things you're taking away personally. What would that look like? So, Chris, I'm gonna start with you.
Yeah, so I'll start with headline message. It's energy expansion. It's not one or the other. It's all of those. And so I think you need to take on your board role as you're advising your executive team, you need to take a big picture look. I say a big tent perspective. Consider all the forms of energy and then the puts and the takes that come with each one of those. Some are lower cost, may have worse emissions. Some may be higher cost, maybe they're better at emissions. You need to think about that mix as you're guiding your company through thinking about energy. And then maybe the headline comment on top of that is energy is a big topic, and we take for granted sometimes, and it's certainly in North America, you can walk out, you can always get gas, electricity's pretty cheap. But this is an existential topic that's, as demand continues to grow, does deserve time in the boardroom. So I think you need to take an inclusive look, and it needs to be a topic for discussion. Tej?
I don't think I can top that, Chris. I think that was really good. No, I mean, I concur with all of that. Again, energy demand is increasing for the first time in a long time. We're seeing a lot of pressures on the systems. It's not a one size fits all that's going to solve this challenge. I think AI is a stress. It's a stress for me when clients ask me, hey, how are we going to power these data centers? And that's fine. It's also an opportunity for us. But it's also a tool that can be used, I think, to potentially reduce the cost of energy consumption at the consumer level. I think that's a very, very important thing to take advantage of. And I'll go back to the technology side. How do we get in front of developing the technologies or investing in the technologies that are going to be needed going forward? There is a long view here. Chris, you used that word several times. There is a long view to be played here. How do we participate and formulate that long view so that we're actively part of the technology transition? There's in addition to the energy transition, there's quite frankly, in addition to a human transition, as we see people move from different jobs into new technologies, which is going to happen as well. I think that's kind of my summary on this, Gretchen.
That's great. Thank you both. Really great. I think if I were to answer my own question, I would be thinking about, energy is generally on the agenda of a board, no matter what company you're sitting on. But what's changed now versus maybe a few years ago is that there's a lot more, I would say, uncertainty, which can present opportunities and risks, and potentially opportunities and risks that boards aren't used to thinking about. And so one example that we did talk about is like the value chain for energy that is being formed now with the demand of these data centers is much different than it looked even just a couple years ago. So you can't call up the utility company and say, I want a data center here. I want you to provide me the power, because they won't actually be capable of it. They won't have the infrastructure. They may not have the generation capacity. And so you're seeing a whole lot of movement going on in generation, in transmission, in data center build outs, who's owning, who's operating, who's not. and what kinds of contracts and what length of time are they being signed for, and how, on top of all that, do emission reduction targets factor into that? So that's the piece that, in my last few years at Shell, we were looking so closely at, because it is, there will definitely be winners and losers. It isn't clear who they're going to be yet. But from a risk standpoint, understanding what that environment looks like, how the sands are shifting, and what role you can play either in that to take advantage of opportunities, or how you can mitigate the risks of not being burned in that space, I think are just almost existential questions for companies at the moment.